Well, for more on the situations facing Palestinians in northern Gaza, let's bring in Mohammed Shehada. He is the Chief of Communications for the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor. Mohammed, thank you very much for joining us. Now, I know your organisation closely monitors the situation in Gaza. What is your reading of what's happening, particularly in the north?
Well, basically, what's happening in the north, to start, first and foremost, it has nothing to do with Hamas. And I can say that 1,000 times. It has nothing to do with Hamas. And Israel itself is saying that repeatedly in Hebrew media, IDF statements saying that this is about emptying the north of Gaza. It's not about Hamas itself. It's about complete depopulation, ethnic cleansing, which is why you have now people like Omar Bertov, an Israeli-American historian and professor of Holocaust and genocide studies, saying that what is happening in the north is literally the final stage of genocide in Gaza. You have now Israeli military generals coming out like Itzhak Cohen and saying that there are no more civilians in northern Gaza, which is completely false, because we know that they're in the northern half of Gaza. There is at least 500,000 people. In Jabalia, Beit Hanun, and Beit Lahia, there is about 90,000 people live there. So what the Israelis are saying is that all the people that are in northern Gaza at the moment do not qualify anymore as civilians in the IDF eyes. They are all legitimate targets. They are all seen as terrorists. Therefore, it is permissible for the IDF to launch a campaign of mass starvation, mass extermination, mass incarceration, and mass destruction, literally systematically, of everything underway in Jabalia, Beit Hanun, and Beit Lahia.
And what's your reaction to a number of controversial laws that have been passed in very quick time by the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, the most notable of which gives the government the right to deport Israeli citizens that it says are family members of so-called terrorists?
It's absolutely horrifying, but it's very crucial that Israel right now is screaming two things to the whole world with these two laws. Number one, that Israel is an apartheid state, legislating laws specifically targeting Palestinian Israeli citizens and singling them out. Although you can see, for instance, under legislation with terrorism, you're seeing a growing trend of terrorist attacks by Israeli settlers in the West Bank that the IDF does absolutely nothing about. Number two is Israel screaming to the world that Gaza is or has been turned by Israel into one giant concentration camp. In the words of IDF generals themselves, like Giora Island, or Israeli historians like Baruch Kimmerling, who've been saying for 2 decades, Gaza is the largest concentration camp on earth. Now, with this law, Israel is saying that if a family member of someone who commits a terrorist offense by Israel's definition, that family member knows about the attack in advance, which is something random, ambiguous, and abstract, it's not clearly defined, then Israel gets to banish them to the Gaza Strip for 20 years, which is like screaming to the world that Gaza is one giant graveyard, one giant cage or concentration camp. The other law that is also critical is the law that is targeting teachers and educators and even administrative workers in the education field, is basically to say that they will be kept constantly under surveillance and they will be dismissed if they display any signs of identifying with terrorists. Again, abstractly mentioned, it's ambiguous, it's up to the education ministry, the interior minister, to define what that means. But early on in the war, we saw an Israeli Jewish teacher that was imprisoned, dismissed, and humiliated even by school children at his own school because he simply put pictures of Gazan and Palestinian victims on Facebook and said they were killed by our pure great army. That was seen as identification with terrorism, and therefore he was humiliated nonstop for it. So Israel now wants to keep all Palestinian Israeli teachers and teachers, even Jewish Israeli teachers who sympathize with Gaza, under the microscope, under constant surveillance, pure emergency martial laws that are applied in the education sector to suppress any sympathy with the Palestinians.
And Mohammed, I know you're here to discuss human rights with us and the situation in Gaza itself, but US foreign policy is clearly a key issue in all of this. What implications do you think Donald Trump's election and presidency starting in January will have for the people of the Middle East?
Well, Israel has been very open about its intention to wait until Trump is president to, quote, finish the job in Gaza. number one, empty the entirety of northern Gaza, half of the Gaza Strip, to be complete, empty, howling wilderness through extermination, depopulation, incarceration, starvation, whatever means necessary. Number two is to restore the supplies of Mk-48 bombs, the 2,000 bombs that Biden suspended in May, so that Israel can rain them on Gaza like candy. Each one of these bombs creates a fireball that reaches the temperature of 7,500 degrees Fahrenheit. It evaporates, it melts anybody in its way. And Israel rained them down on Gaza like candy early on in the war until Biden suspended it in May. And number three is to permanently annex major chunks of the Gaza Strip, and possibly with the possibility of building settlements in these chunks. So there is a whole list of catastrophic policies and strategies that Israel is waiting for Trump to enter the White House to implement immediately. But what is important here is that Biden now has about 70 days left in office to end the Gaza genocide. He has 70 days to correct the catastrophic U.S. foreign policy that's been unfolding for the last 13 months. Pressure now needs to be doubled. Popular pressure needs to be doubled on the White House, since now there is no more electoral incentive for Biden to be constrained by. This is the time where it's possible to implement more policies that would make it difficult for Trump to inflict complete destruction on the Palestinian people.
Mohammed, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on the news hour. Mohammed Shehada joining us live from Copenhagen.